Benno sat down, leaned forward, the stub of his cigar between his fingers. A Jew is sitting in a restaurant reading a Nazi paper.
June 26, 1870, Margaret woke up hot and itchy, but now she just felt angry.
He uses logic and science to topple the pillars of religious belief. As one of many Unitarian Universalists who painfully...
My client's just like you, except he's not got gum or ibuprofen in a purse. His silence is his right.
Her father is taking her away out of New York to be with her aunt on Cape Cod.
I often think of the Cat Stevens song, Where Do the Children Play? And it makes me melancholy, though the real answer should be wherever they want.
Hello, everybody. Good to see such a good crowd here. Thank you for coming and welcome. This is the first event of its kind in recent years, which is surprising, really, because San Francisco is most definitely a city filled with writers. You have only to visit a coffee shop like the Pete's on Fillmore to see people writing away on their pads and computers. Today's presenters have been writing either entire books or reflections. Examples of their published and unpublished works are on display for you on the tables that have been set up. Where are those tables? In the back. There they are. These will give you a chance to learn about the interest and specialized knowledge they have put together in writing their prose and poetry. They'll be reading from either books in progress or already published. All take their craft seriously. Their readings today give them a chance to do what most writers want and need, which is to express their words aloud to a live audience and experience others' responses to their work. Writing is a communal endeavor. Interacting with listeners and readers is a crucial part of the process itself. Many of you have been sitting today and having your lunch with writers at your tables. As UUSF's first audience, you'll be hearing selections of their work that they've selected, as well as have a chance to meet them and ask questions and make comments. As all writers take their work personally, how could they not? We ask you to take care in expressing your responses in such a way as to encourage them to keep on writing. So, first up, we have Dennis Adams. Dennis was born in Vermont, Burlington, Vermont, in 1955. He became an anti-war activist as a youth. Yay. Making signs and posters and poetry, he found himself to be a bit of a writer, realizing the power and importance of a well-written piece to influence the hearts and minds of others. Dennis became a poet and a short story writer. As an actor and activist, he wrote and staged many agit-prop street theater works near or on Penn State campus in the late 60s to protest against the government's policies, especially in Vietnam. He's now been a worship associate at UUSF for approximately 8 years. You've probably heard him in services. Writing reflections and delivering them is a big part of that duty, which Dennis especially loves. If you were to go into our main homepage, there's a section labeled Worship Associates where you can find examples of these reflections. Enjoy life, spread kindness. That's Dennis's motto. Dennis. And Oreo.
should have come up and looked at this setting first. These are just some of my past reflections. And the first one I call Play at Church, or Church at Play. Church as Play. Put this away so I can actually read. I often think of the Cat Stevens song, Where Do the Children Play? And it makes me melancholy, though the real answer should be wherever they want. Give any child a blanket and a stick and watch it become a fort or cave or a stage. I was a mere 6.5 years old when I became a thespian in a college musical production of Cole Porter's Anything Goes. My older brother was supposed to do it, but he got the measles, and a brat was born. Not to be too hard on myself, but the character was a bratty rugrat of a kid running around the cruise ship causing loads of trouble. So typecasting. My favorite moment of the show was also the most terrifying. A character is asleep in a deck chair under a newspaper when another character motions me silently in mime what I should do with my wooden sword. Each night when I poked the actor, he exploded in a loud frenzy and chased me off stage. I knew it was coming, but he scared me to death every single time. What a great world was this place called theater. Then college theater showed me that there are many layers to a life in performance arts. Also, it didn't hurt that the chorus girls would buy me ice cream cones. So heaven. Shortly thereafter, in a theater class for children, I was introduced to the concept that imagination is the key to acting, performing, even writing and directing. I recall that part of the exercise was a large invisible boulder we had to figure out a way around, over, or under. I chose to go through the rock. After all, it was invisible. I already had a rich imagination. Theater just enlarged it for me. I met and became friends with Ben Vereen in the early 70s when he was playing Judas in Jesus Christ Superstar on Broadway. He was quite charming and quoted as saying, "The theater is my church." Funny because I've often thought of church as my theater. We did Joseph and his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat at my University Baptist Church in State College, Pennsylvania. One thing I really loved about this great big sandbox called theater is how big the character of play was. On or off stage, just being around theaters brings out the element of play as play. And then, bam, theater as life. Both the casts of Jesus Christ Superstar and Hair got together and marched from Broadway to Times Square to sing anti-war songs and speak out against the war in Vietnam. The experience of being given a space and told to play with it stays with me to this day. It's still that imagination thing. It's mostly about our oldest shared experiences, storytelling, and how we strive to make that part of our lives. In my case, again and again, acting, clowning, singing, or storytelling, I often return to my roots in the theater. It makes me feel grateful. This sanctuary is so much larger than all of us. It inspires often a kind of hushed awe. But don't forget that it is also a theater of sorts to play in, with a stage, lighting, sound, audience or congregation, and even performers. We are all players, are we not? So bring your imagination here to this magic space and join us in play. Then take that and apply it to your situation, if you can, because play can also be very good for you. And if someone asks, where do the children play? Perhaps we can answer any darn place they please. Thank you. This one's called Bubbles, and I should be blowing bubbles right now to start it, but I forgot my bubble maker at home. So just imagine pretty bubbles, rainbow bubbles floating down. Bubbles are beautiful, fragile, and nice. How can anyone with as delightful a name as Bubbles, a Renaissance man-child, who loves to wear women's clothing and give out snow cones and prickly fashion advice, how could such a bright spot in a sometimes dingy world come to be about death? His name was Anthony Torres, but as I say, he was also often known by Bubbles. It was about 3.5 blocks from this sanctuary, where Bubbles, that this brave And he was gunned down following an argument, a disagreement, a scuffle. He tried to get away, running across the street, but he tripped and fell. And the gunman, who remains at large, showed no mercy with 3 bullets. Over the days and weeks that followed this tragedy, Bubbles' friends and family and many complete strangers made and held a special memorial near where he was shot on Larkin Street. It was made up of hundreds of candles, notes, and outrageous memories, all the goodness and quirkiness the Tenderloin community has to offer, many good wishes from total strangers. It lasted a month. I just wanted to point out the passing of a remarkable person and question myself and others as to how much and deeply these events affect us anymore. Are we so inured to violence amongst our fellow citizens that we sort of tamp it down or ignore it, hoping it will go fading away? That's an ostrich. The tragedy in Las Vegas last Sunday reminds me that much remains to be done to address gun violence in society today. These incidents demand our attention and often break down along so-called party lines, some of it favoring stricter gun control, some opposed to any changes to their Second Amendment rights. I won't dig too deep a hole in that division now, as my main intent today is to tell you about Bubbles, Anthony, and how one bright light in our community was extinguished, only to spark many more lights of peace, challenging my own perceptions of pain and loss. After all, I had the pleasure of enjoying one of Bubbles' free ice cream cones one day, and even I, who had been pretty open-minded, found him a little off-putting, maybe outrageous. What's too outrageous for a clown? Good question. What automatic preconceptions did I put up as barriers between myself and this holy madman? Or how conversely much did I find in empathy and kinship as one performer to another? How easily did I accept the news? Those shots Saturday night, that's what happened? Sad, so sad. Over the weeks since the death of Bubbles, I've had a lot of time to mourn his loss, also to examine my own preconceived notions. I have a whole mishmash of religious views, a virtual tie-dye of isms, but I feel fairly certain that Bubbles is somewhere happier now, somewhere that unicorns and rainbows are celebrated, and there are no guns or bullets, someplace where the sheer amount of love you put out into the universe is the measure of your worth to yourself and others. May our days and years be filled with beautiful, fragile rainbow bubbles, bubbles forever, and one candlelight at a time, may we become closer to our souls.
Next, we have Bruce Clements. Bruce Clements, in high school and college, Bruce wrote stage plays for school productions. In 1967, he published a novel for young adults called Two Against the Tide. The connection has continued over 11 novels, a biography, and an extended report on the life in a drug rehabilitation program, researched and written jointly with Hannah Keep Clements. Bruce is currently at work on a novel set during the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939. Clearly, I have a need to live in 2 worlds at once, says Bruce. Lucky me. And here's Bruce.
Lots of years ago, like 52 years ago, I published a biography of Hannah Hart's grandfather. And so Carol's going to read the first paragraph of that.
1886, and died by hanging in Berlin, Germany, in August 1944. He was never famous, and hardly anyone now remembers his name, but he was a very special kind of man, strong, gentle, intelligent, and deeply honest, with a wild and funny imagination. It was his honesty which led to his death. He refused to tell lies to his friends at a time when telling the truth was a crime.
So now I have something I was working on yesterday. There's a novel, and in this novel, there's a 6-year-old child. The novel is divided. There's 6 and 16, and the 6-year-old child has just lost her mother. And her father is taking her away out of New York to be with her aunt on Cape Cod to get her away from this death, which is, of course, impossible. So, there you go.
Okay. Nora's father drives their car across the parking lot to the factory door. Uncle Bill Drosty, who runs the carpentry shop, comes out of the door to Nora's side of the car and takes her out to carry her across the snow so her slippers won't get wet. Her father walks ahead of them with his briefcase. They go through the door, and Uncle Bill pulls it shut behind them. They walk along the assembly line toward the iron steps going up to the balcony offices and storage rooms. In the dark, every machine seems bigger, and they all look crowded together, so she can't imagine walking between them. Looking up, she watches the big square skylight with its hundreds of panes of glass. The sky is dark gray. She thinks she can see snow flying, but she isn't sure. Go on.
One more paragraph.
There's a light burning in Uncle Bill's workshop. She taps him on the shoulder and points to it, and he carries her there. Her father comes after them, but stops at the door. He takes her from Bill's arms. She wiggles. He puts her down. She goes to the big workbench and climbs up on the stool.
Okay, and I'll stop there because the more time we have for talk together, the better.
All right, next we have Kathleen McClung. Author of 4 poetry collections called A Juror Must Fold In on Herself, winner of the 2020 Rattle Chapbook Prize, Temporary Kin, the Typists Play Monopoly, and Almost the Rowboat. Very interesting titles. Winner of the Morton Marr, Maria W. Faust, and Rita Dove National Poetry Prizes, her work appears widely in literary journals and anthologies. From 2021 to 23, she served as guest editor for the MacGuffin, Michigan-based journal currently celebrating its 40-year anniversary. Kathleen is a faculty member in the English department at Skyline College, where she directed the annual Women on Writing Conference for 10 years. She also teaches at San Francisco State University's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute and leads private master classes for Bay Area writers. Kathleen.
Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks to, where is he? Bruce Neuburger for organizing this event today. Thank you very much, Bruce, for bringing us together. I'm going to read about 5 poems from my chapbook, A Juror Must Fold In on Herself, which grew out of my experience as a forewoman on a jury a couple of years before COVID. And the trial was a vehicular manslaughter case in which a child was killed by a driver who ran into the family in the crosswalk. And I would say that that experience as a juror was one of the most emotionally challenging experiences of my life. And partly why it was so challenging was we were told you can't talk about the case while the trial is happening, and you can't research anything related to the case. And if you tell a teacher you can't talk and you can't research, it's sort of torture. So when the trial was over, I started to write poems, and I wrote several poems and compiled them into a chapbook, which is a small collection of poetry, and it won the Rattle Chapbook Prize in 2020. And I'm so happy to read from it because during the pandemic, we couldn't gather to read. So this first poem I'm going to read, I wrote 2 poems in the voices of the attorneys. So this first poem is called The District Attorney's Opening Statement. Don't put yourself in anybody's shoes. The prosecutor looks me in the eye. Your logic must prevail here. Win or lose, this case consists of facts. Do not confuse them with heart-tugging the defense will try. Don't put yourself in anybody's shoes. Your task, stay in your own. Try not to muse on how it feels to err and cause someone to die. Your logic must prevail here. Win or lose, you 12 must use hard evidence to choose your verdict. You will hear a mother testify. Don't put yourself in anybody's shoes, not hers, not mine, the cops, or the accused. Go somewhere else behind closed doors to cry. Your logic must prevail here. You will lose a lot of sleep, obsess, drink too much booze. No need to be alarmed or wonder why. Don't put yourself in anybody's shoes. Your logic might prevail, but it might lose. This second poem is called The Public Defender First Approaches the Box. My client's just like you, except he's not got gum or ibuprofen in a purse. His silence is his right. I'll talk a lot about the night in question, which was caught on video. Your call, a blessing or a curse. My client's just like you, except he's not inclined to ruminate, to dwell on thoughts of Trump and Pence. He's clear which one is worse. His silence is his right. I'll talk a lot about police departments, how they're fraught with graft, with hotheads prone to pull triggers. My client's just like you, except he's not received a fair shake from these guys. You ought to walk inside his shoes, then write some verse. His silence is his choice. I'll talk a lot. Some sentences may leave you cold, some hot. My job, to sow a field of doubts through words. My client's just like you, except he's not. He's silent, so are you, but me, I talk a lot. This third poem, those 2 that I just read are villanelles, so you might have heard some repeating lines. That's an element of a villanelle. This is a guzzle, and you'll hear a word repeated again and again. It's called Superior Court Guzzle. A list of required questions, like an eye chart, hangs over the lawyer's shoulders. I answer dutifully, can't quite get over 2 men in gray suits gazing back at me, the exact same expression sculpted over their faces, inquisitive and blank. They're almost twins. Later, each will smile strategically, stroll over to our box to hammer home some point, place a hand, cufflink, wristwatch, but no ring, over the narrow wood railing that pens us in. The tall prosecutor in particular casts a spell over me, Not the kind on Sinatra records, more like he probably Googles us, assigns his staff to pore over our profiles, tailors his closing argument by quoting novelists we know. Okay, so I may be overthinking here, but that's what goes on in our little box. We can't talk, so we think about everything over and over. The mother's testimony, the parade of experts, the cops, one with a cane he hooks over the narrow wood railing that pens him in. And when the prosecutor takes aim at Goliath, whose shadow looms over the room, he has my full attention. I almost grip that slingshot, hear the stone whiz over our heads, but no. I freeze neutrality on my face, ache to frown or weep. Later, I will. When this trial is over at last, I will rip that eye chart off the wall, shred it into confetti, stomp on the pieces over and over and over. Two more poems. Thank you for your kind attention. This poem is a sonnet, and it's called The Forewoman Speaks. Among us 12, just 3 have raised a child. We're mostly gray and promise to be fair, and wonder if the prosecutor smiled to greet or warn or both. We go nowhere for weeks. We're stiff and silent in these rows, our faces stony, though we ache to cry. Delete that damn surveillance video, Exhibit A, that shows a girl, 6, die. Night, crosswalk, SUV. And in the end, our verdict signed and dated, read aloud, we will resume routine. Go meet a friend for lunch on Harrison. Admire a cloud above the bridge, 10,000 cars an hour, some back seats full of kids. And I'm going to end with a double sonnet. I wondered if I would ever run into my fellow jurors in the streets of San Francisco, and one day I did. So this poem is about that. It's called The Quietist. The quietist, he sat apart from us, 11, wrangling long paragraphs of guilt or innocence. I wondered, was this man that student in the back who laughs at random intervals, evades a teacher's gaze, and doodles skulls? We were a jury, not a class, that endless week. Those August days, we scrutinized dim video and thought out loud about our negligence, our pure dumb luck behind the wheel. We hadn't killed a child, but one had bled to death, and we were stuck inside that bolted room, unreconciled and tense. At last, the quietist cut through our fog. A sort of Solomon, he knew our fog. A sort of Solomon, he knew. So when he, sotto voce, spoke, we fell silent. Enough of scribbled notes on blue-lined steno pads, enough of almost yelling, weeping, sword fighting. We could agree at last. Go home. Begin to sleep at night again. Peel back thick layers of secrecy we'd worn all through this trial. I thought I might bump into one or two. Our city's small, ripe for coincidence. Last week, nearby, a crowded diner, loud hole in the wall, I elbowed Tom. Look, there's the jury guy. Quick nods, rueful hellos, but we did not discuss. The quietest, he sat apart from us. Thank you so much.
Susan Anthony, longtime member, worship associate, San Francisco native? No. No, okay. Susan.
This is a reflection that I wrote a few years ago now. I sometimes pick up my grandchildren at their schools in the afternoon. It's a good opportunity to spend time with them. One day, Eliza piped up from the back seat, "I don't know who I'm gonna marry." Eliza was 4 at the time. I said, "Well, you've got plenty of time to figure that out." She continued, "I can't marry Mason." Mason is her brother. I said, "Oh, no?" "No," she replied, matter-of-factly. "Our babies would be blind." After a short pause, she added, "Because they would have no heads." I couldn't think of a reply to this, and later I asked her parents if they had talked to her about the notion of siblings marrying each other. They said no. But she got the information from somewhere, and she accepted it as truth. It occurred to me that in this time of post-factual politics, the scientific beliefs of preschoolers didn't seem so out of the ordinary. I was reminded of a radio interview with one of the promoters of intelligent design as a way to bring religion into classrooms. The gist of his argument, as I recall it, was the following. If you found yourself on the surface of Mars and came across a television set, you would immediately recognize that it did not evolve from the surrounding rocks. An intelligent creator must have been responsible. While I was picturing myself in this situation, the speaker cut to the crux of the argument, which involved the intricacies of the human nerve cell. The more he described the properties of this cell, the more I had to agree with him. It is indeed miraculous. So the conclusion he suggested was indisputable. This nerve cell could no more have evolved from nature than did that TV on Mars. The speaker knew what he was doing. His false analogy was wrapped in a confounding mental picture. That is why the noted atheist and scientist Richard Dawkins generally declines to debate with proponents of intelligent design. In his book, The God Delusion, he uses logic and science to topple the pillars of religious belief. As one of many Unitarian Universalists who painfully separated myself from my childhood religion, I appreciated Dawkins' powerful and somewhat snarky takedown of religion. But I was caught up short when he wrote that children should be fully protected from their parents' religious beliefs until they are old enough to choose for themselves what to believe in. He said, "I think we should all wince when we hear a small child as being labeled as belonging to some particular religion or another, because they are too young to decide their views on the origins of the cosmos, of life, and of morals," he said. The very sound of the phrase Christian child or Muslim child should grate like fingernails on a blackboard. Dawkins' words brought me back to the day after my daughter Katie was born. She was extremely premature, weighing only a bit over 1.5 pounds. The neonatologist estimated her chances of survival were 50-50. I couldn't help her in any meaningful way, but I could do one thing. I reached into the porthole in Katie's isolette and touched her tiny face. Reading through a paper mask, I recited the ritual of baptism from the Book of Common Prayer, while the medical staff went about their business all around us. The book was an out-of-date copy I'd been given at my own confirmation, and it had been many years since I believed in the God referred to in the prayers. But the words themselves had been used to bless babies, including the babies of my immediate ancestors, for close to 500 years. Katie did survive, and it was a couple of years later that our family discovered Unitarian Universalism, which happened at another christening service. As the godmother, I held the baby daughter of my best friend at an old UU church in Connecticut. I was expecting the usual plea for God to forgive this child for being born into sin. But what the minister said was something like this: "We welcome this child in the name of the countless stars in the heavens, in all living things on this earth, the mountains, the deserts, and forests and seas, and in the name of all creatures with hands and feet, or paws, hooves, fins, or wings." It made perfect sense to me, but more than sense. It embodied the wonder that I know is the point of dedicating our children and ourselves into a community of faith. It's being part of something together. A reading by St. Exupery in our hymnal reflects this. He says, "We live not by things, but by the meaning of things. It is needful to transmit the passwords from generation to generation." Thank you.
Next, we have Robin Larsen. Having begun my historical mystery novel after moving to San Francisco in 2012, I'm Professor Emeritus of Communication Studies at CSU San Bernardino, where I taught for 16 years. I also taught novel writing for 9 years in Florence study abroad program. Before beginning my doctorate at Temple, I worked in a community organizing, journalism, and public relations. I'll be reading from the first chapter of my book, An Awful Sunday. The chapter is titled, The Night They Brought Father Home. The book's purpose is to answer why the victim, an Irish Protestant printer turned policeman, was murdered. It is set in a frontier river town of Omaha and is told from the point of view of the victim's daughter, Margaret, age 17. Robin.
That Saturday afternoon, Tiny did it again. Exploded with a shout, which she does when she sees a sign something bad is going to happen. She says she watches clouds gather, sees the air darken, then bang, she falls into a fit. Mother began screaming. Margaret yelled at Kitty to hold Tiny down and told Sarah to put a spoon in her mouth. But Tiny says her brain tornado was already slamming her little body around. So then, nothing. On yesterday morning, June 26, 1870, Margaret woke up hot and itchy, but now she just felt angry. Angry at Tiny, whose seizure kept her stuck at home instead of at her end-of-school picnic. She also hated how Mother kept coughing blood and how Father was already crooking his elbow at Fireman's Saloon. She even hated how 5-year-old Hattie still took naps. While Mother finished fixing lunch, Margaret told Kitty to carry Tiny upstairs and lay her down until she was herself again. Of course, Sarah, as usual, was buried in a book, so it was good Mother called her to set the table. The McShanes' usual summer lunch, especially in Omaha's perishing heat, was little more than a handful of wild plums and 1 chilled muffin apiece, which Mother baked from the same white dough she mixed up for bread and rolls, which the 5 McShane sisters washed down with glasses of mint tea. "Is it possible, Mother, Mrs. Jones could let us swap out some of our plums for her apricots?" asked Margaret afterward as she wiped their plates and glasses and handed them to Sarah. Always the McShanes' child most on alert, Margaret already knew the answer. Mother would never ask a neighbor for something she knew was in scarce supply. Only a few women in Omaha could afford the time to grow apricots alongside their vegetable gardens. They were a finicky fruit, only appeared every other year. Back in Erie, summers were nothing like this, but in Omaha, where the McShanes came in 1857, all the seasons were much more emphatic. Alas, they arrived just before the nationwide run on the banks that October, so the value of the lots Father bought went down to nothing, and they couldn't afford to leave. It was still June now, but the heat plastered itself against Courthouse Hill and wavered over Farnham's hard yellow ruts. As Margaret stood that afternoon on the boardwalk outside their front door, she felt the heat beat down like a flat iron. Poor Omaha, trapped on the east side of its 17-mile-long eastern edge by the unruly Missouri River, and on its west side by its ring of yellow clay bluffs. It caught no east-flowing prairie breezes. For those, you had to climb up onto the Prospect Park Cemetery Ridge. It was 4 o'clock when Margaret stepped out to look for Father. Thin, straight-backed, and rangy, Margaret began stamping to keep the soles of her feet from burning inside her shoes. Peering downhill from their frame house at 15th and Farnham, she saw how the brassy white sky was reflected on the river, making the mile-wide body of the Missouri look as if nothing lay between it and the firmament but Iowa's thin brush shoreline. How different the river was from back in March, when it rose to flood level and flung itself out of one bed and into another. Now it lay low, like a starved boa, slow-flowing, silt-milky, and striped with sandbars. Then Father was home, tall, thin, with unruly, reddish-white sideburns, full of talk, always in motion, as he burst through the back alley door for tea. Then, as usual, he sprang out the front door afterward to lope up to Farnham's saloon to help swill another ale or two with his young wagoner, Patrick Rockbud. Returning for supper at 6 o'clock, he stripped off his itchy blue uniform jacket, wiped his neck with a cold cloth, and plopped himself in the rocker as he reported to Mother all the latest news on the street. "Chief Dutcher's got me by the short hairs. Says I'm the only man on the force who can arrest this ruffian Bernard Duran, whose father, Pierce Duran, wants him locked up for committing adultery with Pierce's second wife. No less. I don't believe it for a minute. She's got a face like a mud hen. What would a 20-year-old fellow like Barney want anything to do with a woman twice his age?" Wiping her hands from paring potatoes for the beef stew, Mother sat down on the blue chaise. "Why you, Jer? Why should our police force have to deal with this sordid little family drama? What does this Bernard Duran look like? Is he a large man? Does he listen to reason? What makes you the chief's choice?" Father shook his head. Trust, maybe. Last December, while I waited for Judge Lake to hire me in the new year on a full salary, I was on duty as bailiff one night when they brought in young Duran. He'd snatched a man's wallet on 9th Street in front of his father's smithy. I spoke with the boy, tried to find out why he'd done such a foolish thing, and he told me he wanted to buy his sweetie a satchel. So that was why my Tiny missed what happened at 4 o'clock early on the next day when they brought Father home, the witching hour. After someone banged on the front door, Margaret was the first to wake up. Even then, she could still feel how hot it was, just like yesterday. Running downstairs, she opened the door to 2 strange men who carried Father inside on a stretcher and laid him down on the blue chaise. Eyes closed, lips blue, his usually ruddy face chalk white. Father's look made Margaret nauseous. It was the shock of seeing him so stricken. She was sharp-eyed enough to see a small black hole the size of a paring knife blade in his left temple. By the time Mother came down the stairs, Margaret was bending over for fear she'd faint. Thank heavens, Kitty quick took her by the hand and led her through the dining room to the kitchen, where she pumped Margaret a glass of water. Without speaking, the 2 of them sagged against the sink. A minute later, Margaret rushed back into the parlor, where she joined Mother, who was perched beside Father on a dining room chair so she could whisper in his ear. Taking another chair, Margaret sat at his feet, while Sarah sat straight up beside him in the rocker, pushing it gently with her feet. Then Kitty came in to crouch on the floor next to Mother, her face curtained by her straight black hair as she stared down into her lap. They were all of them in a trance. Margaret thought, staring without seeing. They were all of them afraid that the thing they always feared the most was actually happening, which was that Father was dying. There was also the worry of 9-year-old Tiny lying on her bed upstairs like a rag doll, with little 5-year-old Hattie asleep beside her. Soon both would be up, and like her, Mother, Kitty, and Sarah, wondering what would happen next. "Has he tried to speak?" she asked Mother. "No, he's breathing, but only very lightly." "What happened? Did they tell you?" One of them said this young ruffian, Duran, stabbed him in the temple with a stiletto. "Why?" The word burst from Margaret in an angry shriek. "Quiet, Margaret. I have no idea. We must all stay around him now in case he wakens," said Mary Jane, wringing her hands and then twisting them into her apron, while Margaret and the other 2 oldest McShane girls stirred nervously at the sight of her mother's tears beginning to run down her cheeks. It was still dark when the men brought Father home, but now a gray light appeared in the window of the front door, which opened onto the Farnham Street boardwalk. If someone were to look downhill to the east, they would have seen the sun rising over the Missouri. The room was so silent, Margaret could hear the pendulum swishing inside the clock. Desperate to break the mood, Margaret thought to rise and do something. Maybe feed the stove and bake some biscuits. Maybe put a kettle on to boil. His voluble mouth pursed in a thin line and feet still, Father looked unreal. She realized Mother knew he was already near gone, but did not want any of them to give up, not yet. She'd be hating to watch them understand he was dying, especially now, not with herself so sick with the consumption. Imagine, Margaret thought, we 5 McShane girls soon will be left to run things on our own. Her 19-year-old sister Kitty would boss her around, at least until she finished her last year at Brownell Hall. She'd have only her bookworm younger sister Sarah to talk to. I think that's probably enough.
All right. So last but not least is Bruce Neuburger, author of Lettuce Wars, 10 Years of Work and Struggle in the Fields of California from 2013. and Postcards to Hitler, A German Jew's Defiance in a Time of Terror from 2024. Bruce's short stories can be found in the anthology From Fault Zone, Detachments, from Paper Angel Press. His articles on immigration, racism, and the Israel-Palestine conflict are available at counterpunch.org and monthlyreview.org. Bruce will be reading from his latest, soon-to-be-published book, Postcards from Hitler. And after Bruce reads, we will have a question period for you to ask questions of all the authors.
Thank you, Liz. Okay, let me introduce this piece. It's late December 1938. For 5 years, the Nazis have passed hundreds of laws making life for Jews increasingly unbearable, so as to drive Jews from Germany. In late October 1938, German police had rounded up 17,000 Polish Jewish immigrants and dumped them at the border with Poland. Thousands were left stranded. One family contacted their son, Herschel Greenspun, who was living in Paris. Desperate and angry, Herschel purchased a gun, went to the German consulate, where he shot a consulate official, claiming that this attack was proof the Jews were murderers and terrorists. The Nazis carried out a violent assault on the German Jewish community on November 9 and 10. Among many actions, 30,000 Jewish men were rounded up and sent to concentration camps, including Dachau outside Munich. It's now 6 weeks after the pogrom. Benno was in the kitchen with his old friend Bertold's apartment. Both were wearing overcoats. It was cold outside, and the heater in the apartment was not working well. Bertold was boiling potatoes for food and heat. They would have cabbage and cheese with their potatoes and beer. With all the restrictions pressing in on their lives, their get-togethers over beer were a fragile lifeline. Their conversation up to this moment revolved around the problem of finding food. Now, weeks after the November 10 pogrom, the No Jews Admitted signs had begun disappearing from a few food stores, restaurants, and pharmacies, but places to shop were still limited, and so were funds. Banking restrictions on top of dwindling assets threatened to make them destitute. Benno was selling land cheaply for cash, but was having problems getting buyers to pay. Bertold's Munich store was wrecked the night of November 10, and the insurance payments for the damage were confiscated by the government. Bertold sat at his kitchen table with a bowl of steaming potatoes. Something I haven't asked you, Benno. If you don't want to answer, I'll understand, but what happened to you in Dachau? Benno had said very little about Dachau to anyone since being released. He took a deep breath. Well, what I can tell you, it's the one time in my life I thank God I'm short. Could be the first time you've thanked God for anything, Bertold let out a grim laugh. They had us marching for hours, just marching. We marched from one part of the camp to another. The word went around, try to keep from being too conspicuous. This was harder for the taller guys. The guards loved to pick on them. They were free with their beatings. Benno paused to eat and then continued. In the mornings, they'd have us standing in the cold while they took roll call. The colder it was, the longer they'd have us there in our thin clothes. They'd yell if you moved when not instructed to move. They beat people for just being noticeable. Benno paused with a grim expression. A few times they had repeating phrases from Mein Kampf. They got very aggressive if you didn't shout with a proper enthusiasm. I was hit hard in the back at one of these sessions. We were yelling, "It is the Aryan and the Aryan alone that can be regarded as what we call a man." That was a popular one with them. They had strict rules about what they called hygiene, how you made your bed up and all that, how you hung your food bowl. Any imperfection was an excuse for beating. Guys were beaten and mistreated. Some were killed. I saw guards spray water on a group of naked men outside in the cold. Do you think they survived? They both sat silently for a moment. But I want you to know, Bertold, they knew we were coming. What do you mean? I mean, they were prepared for us. The inmates that were there before we got there told us they had prepared for a big influx of prisoners. After Hitler took over Austria last March, they brought people to Dachau from Vienna and other cities. They had already built up the camp before the Austrians arrived. Since then, they expanded the camp even more. They were waiting for another large group. Then came the shooting in Paris, and they had their pretext. But Bert, before this gets too grim, I have a joke for you. Benno was now standing by the stove to light the stubby remnant of an old cigar he'd saved. A joke? One from Dachau. I can't imagine. Berthold gave Benno a puzzled look. First the joke, then I'll explain. Berthold sat back in his chair. Okay, Benno, you have the floor. Benno sat down, leaned forward, the stub of his cigar between his fingers. A Jew is sitting in a restaurant reading a Nazi paper. This must be before November, before the restaurants close their doors to us. Bert, please, you're going to ruin the joke. This Jew is reading a Nazi paper when a friend of his passes by and stops and says, "What the hell are you doing reading that paper?" The reader looks up at his friend. And the Jewish papers were always being beaten, persecuted, arrested, run out of the country. In these Nazi papers, we own all the banks, we control the media, we practically rule the world. This is much better news. Ha! So that's what you were doing in Dachau, when you're not marching, learning jokes. One horribly bad day, one among many, we got back to the barracks after eating this watery, soupy slop they fed us. We were hungry, tired, depressed. We were sitting in the barracks, and this guy, Carl, I think his name was, he worked at a club in Schwabing. He said, "I'm not a doctor, but I know that when you're being fed poison, you need an antidote. Does anyone have a joke to tell?" And we're all silent. How could we even think of a joke at such a time? And this guy who was always quiet, a thin fellow with glasses and a funny sharp nose, he perks right up, like maybe he's always dreamed of being a comedian and now he has an audience. Anyway, he has this joke and we say, "Okay, let's hear it." So that's how it started. There were more jokes then? Berthold prodded. Yes, it went on for a while, but I've forgotten most all of them, mostly sexual stuff and circumcision jokes. I have a bad memory for jokes. Oh, wait, okay, I remember one. Two Jews are standing at a urinal. One asks the other, "Who did your circumcision? Was it Rabbi Steinberg?" And the other guy says, "Yeah, you're right, but how did you know that?" And the first guy says, "Because Rabbi's cross-eyed, and that must be why you're pissing on my shoe." Berthold shakes his head. Oh, God. Benno smiled in a way he hadn't for months. See what you missed, Bert? Benno, if you'd stayed longer, you might have learned more jokes. I did my 2 weeks in hell, and at that I was lucky. I got out sooner than many. Because? Maybe because I'm a veteran. Benno knocked ash from his stubby cigar. That's what they told you? No, they don't tell you a damn thing. That's just my guess. But you know what they say about Germany and war veterans. Berthold said cautiously, "No, what do they say?" Benno took a short puff. Germany loves its veterans so much, it lets its Gentile veterans go first everywhere. First into the theater, first into the opera, first into sports events, and so on. Yes, and it lets its Jewish veterans go last. Last? Yeah, to the firing squad. Berthold nodded appreciatively. Another Dachau joke? Probably. So it took Dachau to make you a comedian. Who knows, maybe this begins a new career. God knows the humor in the cabarets has gone completely to shit since the Nazis took over. Quite likely, Benno, but how would we know? If we ever showed up at a cabaret, we'd be the punchline. Ha, that's good. You're getting into the spirit, Bert. Of course, it doesn't apply to my nephew. Benno suddenly turned sullen. What doesn't apply? The remark about veterans. Benno was suddenly speaking more quietly. What do you mean? Herman Spatz, married to Tilly, Anna's niece, a frontline soldier for 3 years in the war, in an elite unit, Iron Cross and all that. Didn't mean a thing. They beat the crap out of him in Dachau. They only let him go after he signed over his property in Wolfratshausen to some thug who works at the camp. They both sat quietly. Benno seemed lost in thought. Berthold broke the silence. I have to control my drinking. Beer's getting harder to come by, so I'll start being careful tomorrow. Beer-wise, we're okay right now, Benno threw the remainder of his cigar in the sink. Before Fritz left, he bought a closet full of beer for us. He said, I expect you and Mom to be out of here before the beer runs out. he meant out of Germany. But I've been stupid and stubborn, so I haven't tried as hard, well, until recently. Berthold stood up and put his chair closer to Benno, who was rubbing his hands together to fight the cold. I didn't tell you before, Benno. I can only tell you in confidence now. All right? Benno drank the last of his beer. The evening of the pogrom, before all the destruction began, someone came to my shop and said they'd heard that there was going to be a roundup of Jewish men. He told me to come with him. He took me to his home and he hid me there. Who? I swore secrecy, Benno, and I'm going to honor that. When people came to the apartment looking for me, Hilda said she didn't know where I was, that I was probably at work or buying food. She thinks they were SA types, not Gestapo. Young, nasty, but not well organized. They said they'd be back, but they didn't return. I stayed hidden for several days before going home. Thank God they never came back. Lucky. Berthold nodded. Lucky and grateful. There are still some decent people out there. Bert rubbed his eyes, then he looked over at Benno. And he actually told me a joke I just remembered. Let's see. Berthold paused. Hitler goes to an asylum, and as he enters, everyone jumps up and screams and salutes Heil Hitler. And as he passes from one room to another, same thing. They all stand and scream and salute. Heil Hitler. Hitler's very pleased. Then he goes to another room and passes a person seated there, but this person remains seated and says nothing. Hitler goes up to him and says angrily, "You're the only person in this whole place who won't stand and salute me. Why is that?" The man says, "I'm the doctor here, so I'm the only one who isn't a lunatic." Benno slapped his knee. Good one, Bert. Once this nightmare passes, we should hit the road as a comedy duo. I'll drink to that.
All right. Who has a question? All right. Okay. Thank you. All right, Bruce.
I'd like to ask Kathleen what she thinks the effect of time has on her poetry, in particular the poems about the jury. How does time change what you do?
That's a great question, Bruce. I typically don't write a poem right after the whatever it is. I generally need some time, sometimes weeks, sometimes months, sometimes years. With regard to the jury poems, because I felt that pressure of not being able to speak or research, the pressure kind of built up within me during my experience on that jury. And it was, I would say, a few weeks after the trial was over that I'd been talking about it so much, my partner Tom was like sick of hearing me talk about it. But I wrote a poem a few weeks after the trial ended, and I sent the poem to an editor who I respect, and she published it, and that gave me the impetus to keep writing more as a kind of a way to process and heal from that very, very challenging experience. So it took me several months to work on these poems that are in my chapbook, and after about maybe a year of working on the poems, I felt it was ready to submit as a book. But typically it takes me a while to kind of be with whatever the material is before I can craft a poem. That's a really important question. And to writers out there, take your time, don't rush. Good things take a while to do. Thanks for that question.
Do any of the other authors want to comment on that same question?
I know. The only thing I would say is that, one thing about writing that's kind of interesting, and it's probably true of most every form of art, is that oftentimes when you're not actually thinking about it, when you're not thinking about the writing or not thinking about your poetry or whatever, things come to you just when you're walking, doing the dishes, whatever, just mundane things, because your brain is still working on it. And I think that's one of the interesting things about writing is where that stuff comes from. It kind of comes from your unconscious.
I would agree completely with what Bruce said. I have often found that to be true, that walking, something about the act of walking makes things rise up when you have a block, when you just can't think. You can't think past whatever it is you've written. and doing a physical, these are that. And another thing also is handwriting. I usually handwrite when I'm outlining stuff or just trying something out. And it's when I've got a little bit of an idea, then I can go to the keyboard. But writing by hand seems to help me make it clear.
Anyone else? Susan? Dennis? Do you want? Bruce?
This is
Okay.
the non-comment end of the table.
Right.
Okay.
Non-comment.
Okay, other questions from the audience? Okay.
I wanted to check with Bruce. In the novel that you read from, what was the overarching theme, and where did you get the inspiration for that? Oh, Bruce Clements. Did you hear that, Bruce?
Say it again, please.
Yes. What was the overarching theme of your book that you read from, and where did you get the inspiration for that theme?
I got the inspiration from a personal memoir that a family had published about a young man who lost his life in the Spanish Civil War fighting for the international brigades to save democracy. And I thought, this person's life has to be told in some way, and it's come to me, so I better do it. But the overarching idea is getting free. The focus is a young girl who becomes the 6-year-old who becomes a 16-year-old who is in love with this young man who is killed. And the theme for her, or the need, the hunger that she has, is to live life without her father. And her father is such a powerful person, she is afraid that if she stays with him too long, she will become him. And that's just too horrible an idea for her.
Do any of the other authors want to answer the same question? No? Okay, here's another question.
Thank you. It was very interesting. I do have a question for you. You know, in your life, I don't understand it. Like, I've written some short stories too, but it's always something in my life that really shakes me up, or is some bad thing happening, like, you know, being called on the carpet by your teachers. And I was just wondering if you folks, what inspires you to write, and what gives you the momentum to have to write something down? Because I've always found, like, happy things have happened in my life too, but you just sort of forget about that. But it's things that really affect you strongly, and those are the things I've thought about a lot and try to write out, you know. I just wonder if you have the same experiences, or what inspires you.
I write mostly from experiences, things that I've experienced in my life and others. A lot of it comes from 46 years of clowning, you know, being a clown with making balloons and juggling and all that fun stuff. But I don't know. It's kind of like painting. I sit with a piece of paper and words just kind of pour out of me. I've always been told that I talk too much, so maybe that's one way of getting rid of some of those words.
I think we're all in the same position. We're living in a chaotic world where there seems to be no beginning and no end. And writing, whether it's poetry or essays or fiction, is a way of turning this chaos into something manageable. And that's a very fundamental hunger. We all have it. We're all trying to turn the chaos of our lives into something understandable. And poetry or song or fiction or essays is a way of doing that.
I find that I only write if I'm given an assignment. And being a worship associate, I was given an assignment and a topic, even though it was usually only one word. And then it was sort of easy because ridiculous things that happened in my life, you could work them in, and also sad things. So yeah, it's mostly based on my own life and thinking about those incidents.
One of my favorite writers is Joan Didion, and she said that she writes to find out what she thinks about things. And I'm pretty similar in, something will sort of tickle me or nudge me or intrigue me, and I'll start a poem to kind of see where the poem takes me. And I think that's, for me, the most enjoyable part of writing, is to be surprised by where my writing takes me. I don't start off, I may have an idea like, in Oaxaca on our recent vacation, barking dogs in the distance kept me awake at night. So that little kernel prompted me to write a poem a few days ago. And I was kind of happy with how the poem evolved. So I have to thank those barking dogs in Oaxaca. So the point I'm making is that just sort of little moments or images or small events can spark something, and I just want to sort of see where I can go and where the poem will take me. So that's the pleasure of writing for me.
Well, just briefly, this particular book that I've been working on a long time, in a certain sense, my whole life, because I've heard these stories of my family, from Germany and so on. But I became particularly interested in my grandfather's story. It take too long to explain all that, but I wanted to do it in a fictional. It's a nonfiction book. It's called narrative nonfiction. In other words, it's based on actual events, but I wanted to tell the story through them and not as a narrator. And so, it's challenging, but it's also very interesting. Anyone here who's interested in writing dialogue, I really like. I think maybe Robin and others here may agree. Writing dialogue is great. It's you can sort of invent the characters, and then of course how the characters come out has a lot to do with your personal experience, obviously, right? So there were some characters that were relatively easy to write about and sort of, I think, get their mannerisms of speak because they were very close to me, and their mannerisms were very distinctive. Others, I had to do a little more invention, but yeah.
Yeah, sometimes I get kind of romantic and I think, well, maybe this person who was murdered, who is on my father's side, his mother's father. So he immigrated from Ireland during the famine in 1848, first to Erie and then to Omaha. And that the idea is that this person wants that story told. My father was a great one for telling stories, and that's how he had enormous influence on me. And he was a very engaging person, but he died when I was just short of 16. Almost 16. And he was always wondering about this grandfather that his mother and all of her sisters would never mention. So there was something there, a mystery to fathom. And like Bruce, I had to fabricate most of what I wrote. But by also doing things like reading cookbooks, you go in a lot of different funny places. You go to cemeteries and look at names of people and when people die and what they die of. And if you're a curious person, it's a very satisfying thing to be doing, even if it's hard.
Other questions?
Especially for people who write novels. I'm fascinated by it's like marathon runners. They amaze me. I don't know how you... So when you have an idea for a novel, do you ever find yourself, like sometimes characters can take they take a life of their own and start taking you in places you didn't expect to go. Have you ever encountered a time where it really threw off the outline? And what do you do when you're doing a long story when it gets kind of thrown off and it just seems like the structure seems to need to be a bit pre-planned ahead of time, or am I wrong about that? Or have you ever written a long piece that actually ended up in a completely different place than what you expected?
I one time wrote a novel I thought was the first of a trilogy, and at the end of the first novel, the person I expected to say no said yes, and it blew the other two books out of the water. Just, yeah. You know, the other, and I don't know whether this is relevant to what you're talking about, but I used to get a supermarket bag and cut it open and iron it and put dates across the top and characters down the left side, and then try to plot the whole thing. And which was very useful because it meant that I was always hitting one character against another, and I was aware of what came first, what came second, and why. But by the end of the first third of that outline, I had to throw it away because the novel had become, the story had become such a different thing that it wasn't this book anymore. I had to get rid of it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that planning ahead. Right now I'm on chapter 49, and I've got maybe 50 and 51 yet to do. So I'm really, I'm down to the wire here. I got to figure something out. I don't plan ahead completely. And I think it's the pleasure of having the idea come to you to make you write that keeps me going. And I don't write every day, for example. I used to be much more disciplined. But the pleasure of having it happen, and I always think of that funny song from the 60s or the 70s of, I just dropped in to see what condition my condition was in. And there's something about that the surprise that you can have while you're writing that is very gratifying, and it stays with you. And I did have one horrible teacher. I mean, she really had a very bad personality. She didn't like me a bit. I think she was a little against people who were older. But she was one of the people who said, if you write every day to a prompt, and you can buy a book of prompts and just pick the prompt you want to write to. and sure enough, a lot of that content that you do, if you do it every day, will end up in your book. And so it's the subconscious is helping you, and that's a very important thing, to let the subconscious help you, not disparage the funny or odd thought that you have. It may be the salvation of whatever it is you're writing.
Just to address your question, my situation is very different. I mean, the ending of my book was already before I even began writing it. I knew roughly what the ending was, and a lot of the progression was there. I mean, it was part of the history. It was a question of trying to give that history a personality, to tell the history from the people that lived it, and then within that, of course, there's a lot of ways you could go, right? So, there were dialogues of different characters, and that lent itself to going off in different directions, but it was still within a framework that was pretty well determined beforehand. So it's different than especially what Bruce was saying.
I think not only will the incidents of your life and from prompt books go into the thing you're writing, but they will belong there. Yes.
Back in 1985, I had a Christmas Day fire that destroyed all of my writings that I'd collected since I was 16. And I let that be a mental block to writing anymore. And coming here and becoming a worship associate on John Buren's advice has opened me up to writing again. I think I'll write a clown novel next. So.
Right on.
Let me just add that sometimes it's a horrible tragedy, a loss that pushes us into writing, and sometimes it pulls us away from writing. But aligning with other writers, either in a class or in a writing group, or, you name it. That's, for me, what has helped me develop as a writer. All of my books of poetry were written and published after I turned 50. Until that point, I was writing a lot and I was teaching a lot, but I was laid off from a job in my late 40s, and I said to myself, okay, now is the time to really get serious about my writing. And so I did. I rented a writing office. I got involved in writing groups. So I really just put my writing much more front and center. And that was one of the best decisions I've made, to say to myself, my writing is important to me. I'm going to prioritize it. I'm going to link with others who are also creating writing of all kinds. And there are great places to take writing classes here in the Bay Area, all kinds of great places. I teach at Ollie, which has lots of great writing classes. The Writing Salon is an independent creative writing center for adults. Community colleges have lots of writing classes. So if you're feeling the itch or the urge to write, do it. And I wish you all the very best about that.
Okay. Well, let's.
Paul and I were talking before, and he was suggesting something about a workshop. Is there anybody here that'd be interested in that kind of a thing, or writing workshop? Yeah. Okay.
Okay, and probably among the people who weren't able to stay.
Yeah.
Would be interested as well.
And if there's I know there's people here who have done writing, and maybe we'll be able to do something like this again, and other people will be included. So,
yeah.
Anyway, thank you guys for coming and staying around.
What a success! What a success! Thank you, Bruce, and thank you to the rest of you writers, and thank you, participants, for being here.